Hey folks, if you're looking for a neat twist on the visual novel genre, I've got something special, namely Summerfall Studios Stray Gods. What makes this particular entry so unique is the fact that it's a musical, which begs the question, was Stray Gods a Broadway hit waiting to happen, or was this title tone deaf? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Stray Gods puts you in the shoes of Grace, an aspiring singer whose mundane life is abruptly derailed due to a chance encounter with Calliope, the last muse. Last because the old Greek pantheon is both real and not quite as immortal as previously rumored. A trend which continues to hold true, given Calliope's blood winds up literally, but not figuratively, on Grace's hands. Stranger still, she finds herself the impromptu inheritor of Calliope's divine essence, taking up her mantle as muse, even as she finds herself introduced to the Greek mythos as the sole suspect in a murder case. Unfortunately, this chain of events also leaves her contending with a rather brutal ultimatum. Prove her innocence and find the true killer within a week, or face execution. Still, while Grace has no leads and very few friends, she does have one tool at her disposal: the muse's ability to inspire, which in this case causes those present to sing what's in their heart of hearts. Now, on the execution front, I was quite fond of Stray Gods. It puts a decidedly clever twist on the idea of deities existing within the contemporary world, and does a solid job of fleshing out their journey there, without beating players over the head with lengthy exposition, though it does provide a curious player with plenty of options to delve deeper on their own. What's more, as an avid fan of mythology, I couldn't help but appreciate all the nods to their original legends, as well as their often unspoken flaws. The Greek gods were sort of train wrecks, folks. Still, I would be remiss if I overlooked the narrative quirk at the heart of the game, namely its Broadway stylings and the manner in which it's so beautifully integrated both mechanically and narratively. Quite frankly, Grace's nature as a muse is an incredibly clever vehicle for incorporating the idea of these songs. It was also just a lot of fun to be able to make narrative choices within those musical numbers, allowing you to flesh out Grace during those segments while drastically changing the lyrics, the tone of the song, and even the visuals. It's a really neat detail to toy around with, though I found it was at its most narratively coherent state if you stuck with a single type of response and maintain that habit rather than bouncing around with different musical stylings. That said, while this game is a visual novel that prides itself on providing players with a number of options at their disposal, these don't hold up under closer scrutiny. In fact, there are some notable failings insofar as player agency when it comes to Stray Gods' narrative, and that's largely the fact that while you do make choices, the central events during the route ultimately stay the same regardless of what you've picked, serving primarily to change up which character you'll have the opportunity to woo or confer with while you're in the midst of things. In fact, it'll take near the end of the game to see any notable changes that aren't simply substituted along the way with a different character, the finale and the epilogue being the elements most drastically influenced. But what does this mean about the actual act of playing? Well, as a visual novel, I did expect something fairly simple out of the gate, with the basic idea of picking from a series of dialogue options to progress, and that is what I ultimately got. Yes, there are some timed dialogue choices, but you do have the option of disabling these so that you can actually think over your choices. Well, except those tied to a song. Other than that, the only thing to really be mindful of as you progress are the dialogue choices with a question mark, since these serve to provide more context for the story, the characters, and the events surrounding them, and made all the more notable since they don't advance the conversation, allowing you to delve as deep as you'd like to. Beyond that, the only thing you need to keep an eye out for are the heart options, which advance romances, and those associated with character traits. See, at the start of the game, you're given the option to choose between being charming, clever, or kick-ass, with another option being granted to you at the midway point. What's interesting about these is that they represent a different way of progressing a conversation. That said, the changes they made often didn't feel that significant since they didn't really deviate the route all that much. The most notable one I can think of really involves a chair and is fairly strictly reserved for the kick-ass route. Even still, I did find myself going through the game again, because even when I found myself running through the same scenarios, there were still entirely new song variants to encounter. And I am not exaggerating when I say these are an immense treat. The voice acting is quite good as well, if this particular menace is any indicator.
Well, it's just
I trade in willing favors, Grace. If I didn't, no one would want to do as I ask, and then where would I be? I may seem untrustworthy, but allow me to reassure you. If I wish you harm, you will walk into that harm knowingly and with open arms.
Pan is perfect. Also, weirdly exempt from the sometimes odd audio balancing that crops up, where it feels like the lines were recorded at different volumes, or a voice actor stepped back or towards a microphone mid-line. As for the visuals, well, I generally found them to be appealing. I thoroughly enjoyed seeing all the modern variants of these characters. Hermes, for instance, has some pretty good nods towards their traditional appearance baked into their design without being too on the nose. Really, the only nitpick I have here is that while there are some neat animated set pieces, the characters themselves feel very still, and there's definitely moments where they're talking and the character's mouth is just closed. Still, that's incredibly minor, so let's actually dive headlong into the finale, and quite frankly, I do enjoy Stray Gods' innovations. It's a fascinating experimental title and not something I'd had the pleasure of encountering before. And given that the music was at the core of the experience, I do have to iterate. It was interesting enough to motivate another run-through of the game. Though I should also emphasize that it was specifically this element that had me coming back for more, as my second playthrough really highlighted the game's flaws. Honestly, I never would have caught it until I played again, since it boils down to an inability to fail or really deviate from the main story, to the point that the game feels fairly linear even despite the slight freedom it gives you in regards to talking to NPCs. Yes, there are choices that you can make which change the final chunk of the game, but even then, it's the epilogue where the drastic changes occur. And as for the journey itself, well, early on you're made to choose between seeking help from Apollo or Persephone. This sounds like a major decision with all sorts of ramifications that could occur, except a second playthrough reveals they share a considerable amount of dialogue, with only some minor variations that pertain to their backstories. Really, the choice mostly boils down to who you would like to date, rendering it a rather hollow choice. Pan too suffers. While I adore his arc, if you pursue it through, you'll actually get an identical set of scenes back to back, only further highlighting this linearity. It's honestly galling, to the point that I found myself tempted to skip past dialogue when I found myself retreading old ground. That said, with no log, you can't actually check if there was a slight line permutation. What's more, the game autosaves, so it's not like you can actually set something aside so you can go explore a different option or bypass the act of going through the game to see a single difference in a scene. Ultimately, I have some very complicated feelings about Stray Gods. For my initial playthrough, while it wasn't something I'd gush to everyone about, I still found it good on the whole. I didn't actually encounter any bugs that time around, the concept was neat, and I just had a lot of fun. At face value, I'd even call it a hit. And then I reached the second playthrough and the wheels began to fall off the proverbial bus. Yes, I still had some degree of fun, but now I was in a position to notice all of Stray Gods' flaws. Ultimately, any playthrough past the first feels like a fumble. There's still some value to be found there, but it's a lot rougher around the edges and likely to bounce off someone who wasn't keen on musicals, especially given the visual novel element feels so weak. Still, given the promptness in which the developer addressed an issue with the game's autosaves, I do have a bit of hope they might eventually implement story trees, chapter selects, or even just manual saves to expedite fiddling around with options. Yeah. In any case, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know when there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlian. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.